What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the phenomenal new horror film When Evil Lurks, a.k.a. Cuando, acecha, maldad. I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's been many years since my high school and college Spanish classes, but not to worry. I'm not going to spoil a thing regarding this movie, but I do want to try and persuade a few more people to see this absolutely ruthless movie, a movie made by a filmmaker who really understands what makes the horror genre special, what makes it tick. But this is an international co-production between Argentina and the US, and it's coming to Shudder on October 27th. But it's also playing theatrically right now, and I wasn't really planning on seeing it until I read some of the comments for my review on The Exorcist Believer, and Jake Corinthos, who's a diehard movie fanatic. He recommended this, so it just shows that even when things are getting a little weird on YouTube and the comments are getting a little strange, it's always worth it to give him a cursory glance because you can get recommendations for phenomenal horror films just like this one. So when I got the recommendation, I checked the running time, 1 hour and 39 minutes. That's always a really good sign. And it happened to be playing at the Regal 3 blocks away from me, in spite of the fact that the Regal usually does not play foreign films. But I figured, fuck it. Why not? And I may or may not have eaten a very powerful edible before heading over, and it kicked in right at the right time, and Jesus Christ. This movie not only delivered, but it turned out to be the perfect palate cleanser, washing the taste out of my mouth of Exorcist Believer, giving me the kind of horror experience that I absolutely crave. It's lean, it's gnarly, it's economical, it's disturbing as hell, wildly original, and I'm thrilled to have made my own little small contribution to the movie's overall international box office. But I guess what helped make the movie even more special is that we're going through a time right now in American horror movies where they're overdoing it just a tad when it comes to sequels and remakes of horror classics. And obviously, when it comes to sequels in the horror genre, that is as old as the genre itself. There will always be sequels and remakes in the horror genre. However, we do need the occasional original horror film that brings something new to the genre, and this movie 100% did. I mean, not only was it just ruthless. I mean, my jaw hit the floor repeatedly, just like in the first 10 or 15 minutes. There were even a few scenes where I kind of like let this little moan out like a dying animal. I was like, oh, I mean, it was embarrassing, but the movie was fucking ferocious. But what's amazing is how even as I was making these sounds that resembled like a dying cow, I found myself absolutely fascinated by the story as it unfolded, because it did this brilliant thing where it has its own lore, it has its own rules, but it teases them out in little tiny bite-sized chunks where I was like, oh, like tell me more. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat trying to understand, like, what are the mechanics of the kind of the evil that is on display in this movie. And much to my shock, horror, and delight, each little detail, each little morsel they were willing to give us, each proved to be more sickening than the last. But let's start with the basics. The movie was written and directed by Demián Rugna. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but he's a filmmaker that I'll be paying very close attention to from now on. But the movie stars Ezequiel Rodriguez, Damian Salomon, Luis Ziembrowski, Sylvia Sabater, and Marcello Micheno. I have no idea if I'm doing justice to all these fine actors, but the acting was first rate. I absolutely loved all the performers involved in the story. But I have to admit, when I first saw the trailer a few weeks ago, I was a little bewildered and a little confused because I'm so unaccustomed to seeing a horror concept that actually has originality and something new to contribute. But it looked like a potentially cool art house horror flick, but here is the official brief synopsis from IMDb, which more or less kind of sums up the story in a nutshell. In a remote village, two brothers find a demon-infected man just about to give birth to evil itself. They decide to get rid of the man, but merely succeed in helping him to deliver the inferno. And maybe that gives away just a little bit too much, but I do think if people actually understood what the concept was from the story, it might lure in more people, because this movie, and once again, I got to be careful not to give things away, but it's basically in an environment that feels borderline apocalyptic, but still very grounded in reality. Like, this is a world where demonic possession is a thing, but incredibly rare. It's almost treated like an outbreak of a disease as opposed to something supernatural, although there are supernatural forces at play. But I guess over the course of watching these two brothers trying to figure out what to do about this possessed individual who's all swollen up and bloated and truly horrible and disgusting looking, but as they're trying to figure out what to do with them, and people are reacting in horror to even like moving them or even touching them, slowly but surely we start to learn some of the details about this world. And like, there are certain rules about how to interact with a demon when they present themselves. And if you break the rules, you basically you double down and triple down on all the consequences that you're going to suffer. And it's like the more bad decisions you make along the way, the more you can turn the immediate environment into an absolute hellhole of possession and supernatural occurrences. And the best thing in general is just to leave these fuckers alone. And when you're creating your own world with its own internal logic, with rules that the characters have to follow, what's brilliant about the way this movie does it is how the exposition is delivered in a very organic fashion. Like there's one scene where a little girl is lying in an old lady's lap in the car and just asking for information about this world because she, as a child, has been left ignorant of a lot of the horrors that the world contains. And so this kindly grandmother starts sharing little songs and nursery rhymes that tease out the information to us. But what's cool is how once we as the audience know a few of the do's and don'ts when it comes to interacting with people infected by a demon, what's amazing is how we see the characters, through no fault of their own, making little mistakes. You're like, ooh, that was bad. Like, oh no, I can't believe you did that. And as they commit these little sins or make these little mistakes, they all add up to horrible consequences. And if you're a fan about movies about demonic possession, we've all seen fantastic examples. I mean, you have movies like The Exorcist, where it's just one little girl, she's possessed, and two priests have to do battle, and that's fantastic. Or you got movies like Evil Dead, where an evil is unleashed into the world and slowly but surely starts kind of picking off and possessing everybody in that cabin in the woods. And I feel like this movie probably borrows a little bit more from the Evil Dead approach in terms of there are demonic forces all around, and if you make mistakes within those demonic forces, might start paying attention to you. And if they start paying attention to you, that's when bad things happen. But there are a lot of people who've learned to kind of live off the grid, and they're more or less left alone. And once again, the world feels very grounded in reality, and the rules feel very well thought out. And it was just such a relief to see an original horror story unfolding in an intelligent fashion. Like, we have a lot of horror movies in America, like The Exorcist Believer, that feel like they were written by people who were deprived of oxygen as children, and now they're, unleashing their subpar talents on franchises that used to be cool. And it's just it's so frustrating watching idiotic horror movies made for people with basically who don't appreciate a good horror movie when it's staring them square in the face, like a classic like The Exorcist, or potentially a new horror classic like When Evil Lurks. And maybe I'm reacting in such a favorable way because I went in with zero expectations, where I was so caught off guard by an original experience that perhaps I'm resorting to a little bit of hyperbole and overly praising it, because I do have some criticisms, but my criticisms are minor. I feel like the movie kind of takes a little break in the middle, like a little seventh inning stretch where you feel like they're taking their foot off the gas, and it's almost like they're allowing the audience to kind of exhale, and then they ramp things back up for the finale. So like the first 30 minutes and the last 30 minutes, you're just like, oh Lord, like, have mercy on the poor audience because you are just beating us to death. But it's not like 100% phenomenal from start to finish, but it is really, really solid. And then I think the big revelation at the end, or the big reveal, maybe it doesn't quite stick the landing in as devastating a fashion as some of the earlier sequences. Like, there's some scenes that are just, like, there's one toward the end before the finale where I was in my seat just like retching and driving, like, I mean, I was fucking choking on like bile and vomit. And once again, it could have been the fact that I ate an edible before the movie started, but there was one particularly grotesque scene that really got to me. But what's amazing about the spell that is cast by this movie is that they give us like the red meat, like the gore and the violence that we crave from a really horrific horror movie. But it also allows our imagination to play a role. And I feel like really good horror, whether you're talking about fiction or movies, will give you just enough information where your imagination will be allowed to fill in some of the gaps, and kind of like you're getting a window into a much larger world where you want more information, but because they don't give us all the information that we crave, we're imagining a much more horrific apocalyptic landscape than perhaps they had the budget to afford. And that's a really cool illusion being created by the filmmakers. And so, yeah, I was pretty much impressed with everything about this movie from start to finish. I mean, I would say like 95% of it worked really well for me. And it's cool seeing a movie that's not afraid to wreak havoc with the status quo, because from the moment the movie starts, we know the status quo is very strange. Like, we're living in a world where things are in a state of decline, and like we're kind of aware that maybe the world's in horrible shape, just over the horizon, but we're not quite aware to the degree to which the world might be falling to pieces. But anytime there's a supernatural event, like the event that is the catalyst for the beginning of this movie, well, then that small town or that village or that community is going to suffer horrible consequences. And it seems like slowly but surely, little small towns and communities are being utterly destroyed by people who, in their own ignorance, are making a series of mistakes when it comes to their interactions with demonic forces. But one thing that kept this movie consistently surprising was how the movie employs these emotional misdirects where you'll be really focused on like a bright shiny object over here, not realizing that something really spooky is about to shock the shit out of you over here. Like a perfect example would be a scene where there's a husband and a wife having an argument, and the argument's getting increasingly heated, increasingly melodramatic, and so you're getting emotionally invested in this domestic strife. But it's setting you up for the fact that something totally awful is about to happen over here, and so when it does, you're like, oh my god, like I thought this was what was important, but you were setting me up for this trick. And I fell for these tricks again and again and again. And that was just, usually with like a horror movie in America, you always feel like you're like one or two steps ahead of the movie. And it was just nice to be surprised for once. It was nice to have a fresh, original, sickening experience. And I don't care how jaded you are. I don't care how many Italian horror films you've seen. I don't care how many like weird early 70s classics you've seen. No matter how bitter and jaded you might find yourself, or no matter how cynical you might find yourself, there are going to be a few scenes that really just wrap their fingers right around your throat. And like many great horror movies, it is nothing without its great score. So shout out to the composer Pablo Fuu. I don't know how to say his last name, but he basically like layers in throughout the movie this kind of constant, like it's almost like heavy metal, but kind of like a slow like pulse in the background that just gives the movie this great energy and this forward momentum where like I was constantly like wanting to kind of just like play air guitar while watching the movie, but usually I was too grossed out and horrified by what I was watching to get too into the music. But the music is absolutely first rate. And yeah, it's thrilling to see an international horror film getting a big release in America, or a semi-big release. Shudder is a great platform for horror enthusiasts, and obviously the timing of this release could not be better. So if, like me, you're sick to death of watching filmmakers like David Gordon Green pissing all over a horror classic like The Exorcist, check out When Evil Lurks. Once again, brand new original story, and it tackles like demonic possession in like a supernatural horror setting in a way that I've never seen explored before. And at this point, I've seen so many movies dealing with demonic possession. I didn't think it was even possible for a movie to have a fresh, original approach to this. But goddamn, it's almost like they're reinventing demonic possession from scratch and making it just fresh and new again. And another aspect that consistently delighted and surprised me was the different ways they chose to portray people that may or may not be influenced by and or possessed by a demon. Like the most obvious one, which you see in the trailers, like the big, bloated, giant, disgusting guy with all this ooze coming out of him. But what's interesting is how, like, once you start making mistakes in the presence of a demon, leading to other consequences, it's almost like kicking a hornet's nest where there might be all these unintended consequences, where the movie does this thing where you genuinely, sincerely believe that at any moment, due to these demonic forces, that something horrible might happen, whether it comes to accidents or animals behaving in a strange way or the dead rising from their graves. But it's almost like it causes a chain reaction where things just get worse and worse and worse. But what's cool is how some of the actors, when they're first being kind of influenced by these supernatural forces, without the aid of any prosthetics of any kind, can convince you that they're under some sort of demonic influence, and just like eerie little line readings or the way they'll kind of look off to the side. But they made me believe. Like there was no, I didn't have to worry about suspension of disbelief. I was completely, totally invested in this world. And I think what helps quite a bit on this front is that most of the special effects, when used, are in camera. There's a lot of practical effects that are very convincing, very persuasive. A little tiny bit of a digital finessing here and there, and you'll be like, oh, I can tell like that was digital blood or whatever the case might be. But I think on the whole, the special effects they're very subtle. And they're very convincing because, once again, practical effects are just more convincing than digital effects in the horror genre. So who knows, maybe if this movie does well, he'll get a chance to expand upon this world and give us a follow-up. But no matter what Demián Rugna does next, I will be first in line to check out all their future productions. So thank you so much for listening to my rant on this subject. I hope I've managed to convince a few people to put When Evil Lurks on their calendar. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, email, and hunt me down on Twitter at Colrex. But thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And thanks again to Jake for recommending the movie. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.